Our third session today is going to talk about integrating logic apps with BizTalk Server on premises, and that's going to be using the new Logic Apps adapter. Well, two things actually, the BizTalk Connector in Logic Apps, and then also the Logic Apps adapter in BizTalk for going the other direction. How many people in this room have actually used BizTalk Server before or worked with BizTalk Server? Oh, good. So more than half of you. That's pretty good. So those of you who haven't used BizTalk before, you may find the lab a little bit challenging. You're not going to actually have to develop an application. That's going to be provided for you, but you are going to have to install and configure the application, and there's a few steps with that. So just give a shout if you need some help with it. So again, going back and looking at the hybrid integration platform, we talked about before about how at the center of everything is Logic Apps and BizTalk Server. Logic Apps working and connecting all of your cloud resources and running workflows there, and of course BizTalk Server connecting everything on premises for you and giving you also the ability to reach out to the cloud when you need to. So the way that we do that, we have the managed connectors in Logic Apps, and one of them is a BizTalk Server connector, which again uses the on-premises data gateway to be able to reach down on premises and connect to your BizTalk Server. So the BizTalk Connector is basically another Logic App API connector. When you configure it, just like with the SQL connector that you used in the last lab, you tick the box that says use the on-prem data gateway, and you'll be able to select one of the actions, which can be either to prepare a message, which it does from interrogating the schemas in your BizTalk instance, or be able to send a message. So once you select that option, then in this particular case, we're actually configuring the send message, and when you go into that drop-down, it will actually enumerate all of the receive locations that are exposed by your BizTalk Server instance that you've connected to. If you were doing the prepared, which is the other option, prepare message from JSON or XML, it would go to your BizTalk and you'd be able to enumerate the schemas that are currently deployed. So let's talk a little bit about BizTalk Server. It's Microsoft's premier integration product for on-prem. And it's been around since the year 2000, although you probably wouldn't have wanted to use the product at that stage. It actually really came to fore in about 2006 when it was rewritten in .NET and incorporated a new administration console, and the concept of applications was a lot easier to deal with from that point on. So at the heart of BizTalk is an extremely powerful and resilient messaging engine. It's very finely tuned for performance, it has persistence, it has everything that you would need in a publish-subscribe messaging system. It also comes out of the box with a whole bunch of adapters that enable you to connect to some of your typical line of business systems, as well as all the standard protocols like, SMTP and file and HTTP and SOAP and all of that. So you don't have to write any of the plumbing to do that. One of the advantages of BizTalk is it gives you the adapters that you can simply configure to send messages to those resources and protocols. It also encompasses orchestrations, and orchestration is basically the way that you achieve business process automation. So those business processes can be very short running, they could take a few seconds to run, or they could be long running and take months. So BizTalk gives everything that you need to persist the state of those so that you can manage long running and complicated processes. Along with that, it includes a business rules engine, which is where you would abstract away those rules and policies that tend to be more volatile in your system, and you might want to be able to update those periodically without having to do a new deployment. A few other features it gives you, business activity monitoring, which gives you end-to-end tracking of what's happening across your integration systems, and not just necessarily instrumentation. You can use it for that as well, but the real power in business activity monitoring is it's designed to be able to escalate business level data and aggregate all of that into data that you can then write reports from that would be to the interest of people like your CEO or your CIO. Too infrequently actually do I see it used for that purpose, but that's really what it's designed for. From the most recent versions of BizTalk, they have started extending the hybrid capabilities of it so that it's easier for it to reach into the cloud. Oh, something I forgot to mention before. BizTalk is also very powerful at doing B2B stuff, so it's got all the EDI functionality built into it and support for AS2, X12, and Edifact. So with the hybrid, in the more recent versions, you've had the ability through things like the REST adapter, the Service Bus adapter, and now in the latest version, the Logic Apps adapter, to be able to connect to your resources in Azure very easily in both directions. Because Microsoft recognizes that the power of integration really is in hybrid applications where you can take advantage of the features in the cloud. And another component that it used to include was RFID support, but for some reason in the latest version of BizTalk, they've deleted that. At the moment, there's no replacement for it that I'm aware of, so not sure what the idea behind that was, or the roadmap. I'm guessing that it wasn't used very heavily, or maybe people are moving more towards IoT solutions, I'm not sure. So essentially, BizTalk, it's a server-based product. Its original purpose and power is in integrating on-premise applications, or for either within your organization or with other organizations, connecting business to business. But lately, we're now moving towards being able to connect to cloud applications using those adapters that I've mentioned before, and then getting the power of that capability. So what's new in BizTalk Server 2016? Because BizTalk Server relies on SQL Server and also is installed on Windows Server, and you develop applications in it in Visual Studio, and you use Office too for some components like BAM, then there's sort of a bit of a coupling with the particular versions of those products, and every time they upgrade one of those projects, there's a compatibility issue. So a big driver for each release of BizTalk Server is platform alignment, to make sure that it can run on the new versions of those products. So that's definitely part of it. But something pretty significant about supporting SQL Server 2016 is that you now have the ability to take advantage of the always-on availability that SQL Server 2016 offers. And that's actually a pretty big thing for BizTalk. Prior to this, the only DR capability of BizTalk when you have multiple databases was to use log shipping. It never supported database mirroring. But now, with this version of SQL and BizTalk, you take advantage of always on, and it's much, much simpler to have your DR situation set up in your high availability scenarios. I say it's easier theoretically. In practice, actually, it's a little bit complicated to do it because you need to set up about anywhere from 4 to 8 instances of SQL to support it, but that's another issue. Very significant about this is until now, if you provision BizTalk in the cloud as an IaaS solution, which you can do, you can run BizTalk Server in the cloud, it never supported HA in the cloud. Now it can. That limitation wasn't really a BizTalk limitation, it was a SQL limitation. But now that you have always on, it's able to do that. And of course you have the new Logic Apps adapter too, which just increases that ability for building hybrid applications. So I gather this image is about being able to harness the power of the cloud from your on-premise. So looking at the Logic App adapter, you're going to have a chance to work with this in the lab. Those of you who know BizTalk are very familiar with this screen. It's a port configuration. And one of the things you set in there is always the adapter type. So the Logic App adapter is a new one that you can select. You click the Configure button, and in there you have the ability to set the properties. And of course, the most important one, like all of the receive adapters in BizTalk, is setting the URI. And it's always a relative property. You don't include the local host information. But then there's also a public address that you need to expose, which does show the local host. And the nice thing about that, and you'll find out in the lab, is that once you've filled out the top box, when you just click in the bottom box, it automatically populates for you with the server name, so you don't have to type all of that. You also have the ability to specify some custom HTTP headers if you're interested in doing that. So that's the receive side. For the send port, very, very similar. You choose the adapter that you want. In this case, it's a Logic App. You click Configure. And in this case, instead of being able to just manually type, what you're actually doing is you're selecting a webhook in a Logic App that you have deployed. So you get a dialog that comes up. It asks you to sign in to your Azure account, and then you provide your subscription and your resource group and the particular Logic App, and through the process of enumeration, it allows you to select the one that you want to connect to. So what does this capability allow you to do? So let's look at a sample situation here. So say you have an on-premises BizTalk installation, and it's an order system. So you've got orders processing application as well as a customer's database. And an order comes in, it goes through BizTalk, it stores your order, and it goes to look up the customer. And it finds out, oh, you know what? We don't have this customer in our database anymore. So as it happens, you've got Salesforce that's managing your customer data. And you need to create a new customer in Salesforce, but that lives up in the cloud. You also want to probably notify some people, maybe by Yammer or some other mechanism, that, hey, we've got a new customer on board. You know, maybe somebody should contact them. So BizTalk, using the Logic App Connector, can connect to a Logic App, which gives you that very easy connectivity to Salesforce through its managed connectors and Yammer. So it can manage that for you, and it creates the customer in Salesforce. It replies with the customer ID and sends that back down the BizTalk server, which then stores that into the customer database. Now let's go from the other direction, and let's say that we need to update customer details. So this would start from your Salesforce application. You'd work from there. So you'd update the customer there, and you'd invoke as a webhook that's triggered by updates another Logic App, which then uses the BizTalk Connector to then send that information back down to your BizTalk server on premises and then store the updated customer information. And all of this, of course, is made possible through the on-premises data gateway. So the BizTalk Connector, just like the SQL one, makes use of that. When we said all the on-premise resources that were supported, one of them, of course, is BizTalk Server. And here you have the case where you have a Logic App that's enabled through the on-premises gateway to talk to your BizTalk server on-premises. The other thing we should talk about a bit is Service Bus. So you started that with your first lab. A little bit, you created a namespace and you created a queue. In this lab, you're actually going to create a topic with 2 subscriptions. So how many here have worked with Service Bus before? I think I saw there was about half a dozen of you, right? Yeah. So it's probably worth saying a few things about it. Basically, it's designed as a messaging system. I really like Rob Fox's description of it. He calls it the online postal service, which is probably a good way to describe it. You have queues, obviously, which you're probably very familiar with working with. Queues are very simple. You have a sender send something to a queue, and then you have and it gets back an acknowledgement, and then you have a receiver that can take things off that queue whenever it's ready, and then also, of course, sends back an acknowledgement. If the receiver doesn't complete the transaction within a certain period of time, then it's abandoned automatically so that message can be picked up again. And obviously the scenarios this supports is in the case where there's not necessarily a synchronicity, if that's a word, between the 2 systems. One might be offline, or you might want to do some throttling so that the downstream system can take messages only when it's ready to, if it can't accept them at the speed that they're being delivered. So topics and subscriptions are a little bit different, even though they're actually built on top of queues. So in this case, you have a sender that sends something to a topic. That's fine. They only know about the topic. They don't care about who's subscribing to the message. They're publishing something out there. The difference with the topics as opposed to queues is that you can have multiple subscriptions. Then you have filters on those subscriptions to designate which messages that particular subscriber is interested in receiving. So you have your filters that you define, and then every subscriber can get a copy of that message if it matches the criteria in the filter. So this is now truly a publish and subscribe model, just like BizTalk Server supports. The other feature in Service Bus is the relay. So the relay is meant to solve this problem of getting across network boundaries. And it's the basis of the hybrid cloud. The on-premises data gateway is actually built on top of Service Bus relays. If you can imagine, you have a client and a service, and they're in different organizations, and they're behind their respective firewalls. So the client sending a message out through their firewall is probably not that difficult, because firewalls don't tend to block too much that's going out if it's on standard ports. But the other service receiving that message through the firewall can sometimes be a bit difficult, especially if the security people don't like punching all these different holes through the firewall. So the way that we can get around this is you set up a service bus relay in the cloud, and what that allows you to do is the target service can basically set up a listening endpoint in the cloud, which then you give that to the client, and when the client sends to that listener, they can send the message across that channel. Because the channel is instantiated as an outbound channel, it doesn't run into issues with the firewall, but it allows messages to come through. Michael Stevenson described this quite appropriately as it's like putting a router in the sky. And it is highly secure, so you need to have special shared access signature keys and stuff to be able to get to that endpoint and send messages. So again, all of this capability between using the logic apps and the service bus and the on-premises data gateway is about enabling you to build hybrid applications. So it allows businesses to leverage the power of Azure, which would be elastic scale, the high availability, and the global reach, and also make use of their on-premises systems without having to worry about moving those to the cloud, which typically is not appropriate for them. So, are there any questions before we move on to the lab? So, for this lab, you are going to build a logic app that uses the BizTalk Connector to send a message down to BizTalk Server, and then you're going to send it back up to Service Bus using the Service Bus adapter in BizTalk. So this is one probably has the biggest prerequisites of all the lab, not the, the least of which is having a BizTalk Server instance, but I think we've got everyone sorted with that now. When you created your on-premises data gateway in the previous lab, if you didn't do it on your BizTalk Server instance, you're going to have to do another one for this one, but hopefully most of you use that same machine. You're also going to use the legacy order system database again that you should have imported in the last lab. However, there is an extra step you're going to need to do in order for BizTalk to have access to that application. You're going to have to set up some permissions. So in the appendix of the lab document, there's some instructions about how to do that. It's a pity I couldn't get my own instances of the BizTalk up and running because I actually already had done that for you. Okay, so basically the steps are you're going to install the BizTalk Logic App adapter on the BizTalk server. It's a very easy install to do. You're told to create a Service Bus namespace and topics. You can use the Service Bus namespace you created in Lab 1. You don't need to create another one. You can just use that same one and add the topics to that. Doesn't matter. And as I said, you don't have to write the BizTalk application. It's been written for you, but you are going to have to deploy it to your BizTalk server instance that you have on your machine. The lab tells you how to do that. You'll also need to configure the ports, and there's a number of steps in that. So some of you who haven't used BizTalk before, you might have a little bit of trouble with that. So I'm happy to walk it through if you need that. And then finally, you're going to create the logic app that BizTalk actually connects to. Any questions? Let's go to it.